Mapping Multiple Histories of Korean American Transnational Adoption by Kim Park Nelson in Contemporary Asian America, edited by Min Zhou and Anthony Ocampo. Geopolitical History of Adoption. The first generation of Korean adoptees were mainly war orphans. They happened during the various wars with the various countries surrounding it, but in particular, what Americans call the Korean conflict that resulted in the divide between the North and South currently. What was left for the Americans were many mixed race children and also lots of mixed ethnic groups from the other war efforts from other countries in terms of colonization. Now, why was there adoption? Well, there's sympathy, obligation. For example, America was involved in this military excursion there, national pride, convenience, or was it guilt? Question mark. There's also a lot of historical intergenerational trauma from this adoption. Racial histories of Korean adoption. 1953 is the first 1,000 transnational adoptions, and there's lots of really important concerns. For example, that people brought up, the Association of Black Welfare Workers predicted that transracial adoptees will have poor psychological and racial identity, such as, for instance, in the Midwest, such as these Anglo-American families who don't necessarily have any knowledge of Korea or any Asian culture are adopting these Asian Korean children. The second thing was to know is in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act prohibits the transracial placement of American Indians into non-native families. And again, and this has good reasons, very justified, because if you look into the long history of, unfortunately, this terrible history of the boarding schools that were up and down in Canada as well as the United States, where they took away these Native American or Native Indigenous Canadians, took them away from their family and put them in boarding schools where they were severely abused, there's quite a few books on this if you want to look this up. And they took away their culture, their language, a lot of the social and cultural things that were so crucial in their religion from these Native children. And then they fostered them into these racist boarding schools where they were heavily abused. And because of that, now no non-Native person can adopt a Native child. So you have these two things in the background when you think about these mixed race. A lot of them are mixed race Korean Americans or single race, but again, into all Anglo families, particularly in the Midwest. So there's a racial hierarchy that this article talks about, how Asians are, quote, closest white adjacent to the model minority, contributed to the perception that Asian Americans were not suffering from racism. But of course, that's not true. The model minority is created by others to use Asians as an anti-Black sword. It's actually a divide and conquer technique to divide Asians from other people of color. Now, adoptions of Asians into white homes appear safe, and that was one of the things that why they were allotted as viable adoption type of person. Now, transition to transracial. Tend to assimilate to adopted parents' culture. Korean stigma against domestic transracial adoption. So basically what it's saying, in Korea, there is a stigma against adopting a different racial group, or even, so for example, mixed Koreans, but also other Koreans. And this has a long history because of the war, and people, you don't want to adopt people that were part of the colonizers that came over that bombed your country. And this same criteria also happened in Vietnam, where in Vietnam, a lot of Vietnamese did not want to adopt these transracial or mixed race children from the US soldiers who, of course, were bombing their country. So overwhelmingly, the majority of these children were adopted into white homes. And in the 1950s, adoption of racially mixed people since the 1950s were supported by societal transformations. Now, a social history of transnational adoption. Globalization through participation in the global marketplace. 200,000 Korean children have been transnationally adopted. And again, that's a small number because actually it's actually more than 200,000 now. And also it's a transnational adoption is kind of like American culture, American national custom now. A lot of people do it. It is a thing for multiple people to multiple Americans to adopt transnationally. But again, something to think about when we have so many children in America that needs to be adopted. Immigration history. Korean adoptees don't see themselves as immigrants, but they share characteristics with other immigrants. In 1961, federal immigration legislation for transnationally adopted children. Also in 2000, Child Citizenship Act, transnational adoptees of U.S. citizens had access to automatic citizenship. And we'll talk about that at the end because this is very crucial because there is now a deportation trend, unfortunately, of these poor adopted Koreans who were very much abused in the United States and they never got citizenship. So if they committed crimes to defend themselves or to survive when they're abusive adoptive families abuse them, they now are subject to deportation and some of them have been deported. So here's a book by Kim Park Nelson called Invisible Asians. Adoptee history. In 1990s, the first Korean adoptees conference supported to provide info and support. Public adoptees do not attempt to advance, quote, political agendas, but may be considered identity activists. Adoptees to consider identity, experience, creativity, scholarly work, community built with other Korean adoptees. And yes, there are these circles of Korean adoptees associations, as well as Chinese adoptees and the various other Asian adoptee networks. Emergence of adoptee artists and academics. Adoption researchers now, they influence ethics. They research a lot of things like ethics, gender, sexuality. Adoptee artists have used their experience of identity crisis, displacement, family loss, and racism to create unity through art. And so that is if you look at that beautiful art by a Korean adoptee. And again, nothing about us without us, a battle cry for inclusion. Adoptees want their history to be known. And so you see like other artists talking about what's it like to be a Korean adoptee in the United States. Making Korean adoptees Korean again, 422, page 422. 1999, South Korean F4 visa can grant overseas Korean citizenship, grant all rights of native Koreans except voting, rights to own property and business, and the right to reside in South Korea without a work-related sponsor. 2-year term may be renewed indefinitely. Adoptees who seek the F4 visa, the irony is claiming legal orphan status to reconnect with Korea is enormous. And so, this is, of course, unfortunately, what's happened is a lot of people, some people have been deported. And so they now have to get visa status in the country of their birth, which is, quite ironic. So again, I want to highly recommend that you watch these 2 videos, 2 movies, one that just came out, Blue Bayou. It's kind of a real life story of a Korean adoptee who was heavily abused as a child and, ran away and had to support himself. And so got into little trouble and then paid for his time. But then now in his adulthood with a family subject to deportation, unfortunately, based on a true story. And also a great documentary called In the Matter of Cha Hung-hee, a film by Deanne Borsche Lim, talks about her own adoptee experience. And she goes back to Korea to find her, her relatives. And both great stories for you to consider to watch.